You're welcome back to Drive Time. It's 13 minutes past 5. At some point in the future, for those of us who reach retirement age, we will need to think about our pensions and what we will have to live on in our old age. The problem, however, is that we are facing a black hole in our future pensions pot, and whether or not it will be possible to fund everyone in the future is really the big question of the moment. And the options for filling that hole are not especially appealing, raising the retirement age or increasing PRSI contributions. Well, to discuss the extent of the problem facing us, I'm joined in studio by Samantha McConnell, who is Chief Investment Officer with IFG Corporate Pensions. I'm also joined by the Pensions Ombudsman, Paul Kenny, and on the phone we're joined by Eamon Timmins from Age Action Ireland. You're all very welcome, and thank you very much indeed for coming in. Samantha, I'll start with you because you're arguing in an article today in the Irish Examiner that the state pension, that is where the focus should be, and that is what needs to be changed.
Well, I think I'm really arguing two things. Effectively, that the state pension into the future will be unaffordable. The deficit on the state pension is going to increase to about 207% of GDP, or to put it in real terms, twice the current national debt. And that would mean that if we tried to fund that deficit, the PRSI contributions would have to increase to 27%. And in any man's language, that is not a runner. But in addition to that, I think the other issue that faces us is that public sector pensions currently have a deficit of 108 billion. And again, those two, if you like, large elephants in the room are becoming unsustainable, and it's the poor old private sector worker who ultimately is picking up the can for that.
In terms of the state pension, is it your argument that it should be means tested?
I think ultimately I don't mind whether it's means tested or brought down to a basic level. I think either one of those would work. I think ultimately it's the sheer quantum of it that is unsustainable, and I think the big issue, certainly for those who are still in the working environment, is that they're currently funding for something that they may not get. And ultimately it's about addressing the inequality between those in receipt of the state pension and those who may never get it but who are actually funding for that.
Eamon Timmins, I'll bring you in at this point, Eamon, because the underlying point being made in the article, among others, is that the current state pension is not sustainable. What do you say to that?
Well, I think certainly at its current rate, older people, the current generation of older people have paid into it for 40 years, and many of them, I think the big problem, and I think Samantha touches on it in her article this morning, the big problem is that many older people are dependent on the state pension as their main or only source of income, and that's a very serious problem. For just put it in context, 60% of income for 65 to 74-year-olds is coming from the state pension. 75, three-quarters of the income from 75-year-olds and over is coming from the state pension. So they're heavily dependent on the state pension, and so any changes, like such as the recent speculation that it might be cut by €10, it causes huge hardship for that generation for whom it is their main source of income.
And yet, Eamon, if you look at some of the figures, for example, most recent from the CSO, they make the point that between 2004 and 2011, the average income of elderly people increased by 41%, almost 4 times more than those in the age group of between 18 and 64.
And it rose from a very low level. It was €163 around that level. So it came from a very low level. In 2004, of the three groups of, say, working age, under 17s and over 65s, older people were at the bottom of that income group. In 2011, after that 48% increase, they were still at the bottom of the group, but the gap had closed. And we're not into creating intergenerational strife, because many of the older people we represent have children and grandchildren who they're equally concerned about. But
do you have any difficulty with means testing the state pension, Eamon?
Sorry?
Do you have any difficulty with means testing the state pension?
I think we would have a difficulty for people who've paid into it all their life, and then they're going to be penalised if they have any other income, depending on where you draw the line on the means test. But if for example, I pay into a state pension all my life, and I never go on a foreign holiday, and I don't drink or smoke, and I live a very frugal lifestyle, and then the result is the state comes back and says, well, Timmins, you have X euro, we're going to cut your state pension. That wouldn't be fair either. So, I mean, I think certainly, we do. I mean, we would agree with the thrust of Samantha's article that the state pension we need to address. I think one of the things we need to address is make sure the state pension stays at a level which keeps people out of poverty. But we also need, and we have failed spectacularly, to get people to take out a private pension, to take out some alternative, some added support to the state pension to keep people out of poverty.
And we'll talk more about that in a few moments. But Paul Kenny, Pensions Ombudsman, to bring you in on this question of the state pension, the Irish Times has an opinion piece this morning entitled "Lucky generation question mark. And they're making all these points about incomes and the elderly and how they have risen in terms of in relation to other people in the community and society as well. Do you think older people are being protected?
I think older people are being protected in many ways. As you know, if you make a change to the state pension at the moment, it'll probably affect future people, not existing people. It's the same in the private sector. If you wind up a pension scheme, the pensioners have first priority over the assets of the scheme at the moment, and there was talk about changing that, but nothing has been done about that. So pensioners are a protected species right at the moment. That's not to say that they will be indefinitely.
Should they be?
Well, the problem with pensioners is that they don't actually have representation. You can't go to the LRC if you're a pensioner. You can't go to the Labour Court. The unions won't represent you. So you're high and dry. You've nothing else. You've no means of affecting your own future anymore. So you're stuck with whatever you've accumulated in the past or whatever rights you've accumulated in the past. And there is a difficulty also in the structures that we've built up, because both in the private sector and increasingly in the public sector, the pensions that are paid from occupational pension schemes are what they call integrated or coordinated with state pensions. So if you mess around with the amount of the state pension, you're going to affect something else down the line. So it's not as easy as it might look from the outside.
Samantha, Paul says there, if you're an elderly person, you've no one to argue for you. But would you argue that they have a very powerful vote, and that perhaps that is where the problem is, that politicians are too afraid to do anything about it?
Well, I think the grey vote is powerful, and we've seen that in previous campaigns where they've managed to overturn government policy. I think ultimately we have to recognise that state pensions are unaffordable, and it does take hugely unpopular decisions to be made, and pain has to be shared. And I'm not saying it needs to be all on the pensioners, but neither should it all be on the workers. Why is it that somebody who's 65 and over gets everything and those who are 63 get nothing? And ultimately we need to be able to address a hugely complex issue in a coordinated way. And that really looks at making change over a period of time. We're not talking about making a change right now, because I'd agree with what Eamon is saying. You have to give people certainty. You have to give them visibility so they know what they're saving for. And ultimately what you need to do is plan into the future. Give people a clear road to what they're achieving and then go for it. What I think has hurt people over the last 5 years has been the huge degree of uncertainty around the whole issue to do with pensions.
I think there's been a lot of divisiveness about this too, and people running a wedge between the public sector and the private sector. And there's no doubt that the private sector is suffering badly because of the underfunding, particularly of defined benefit schemes, and the inadequacy generally of defined contribution schemes. But we mustn't forget also that the government, because it was able to, simply reduced pensions already in payment on public sector workers, imposed a pension levy, which was actually a salary reduction in disguise, not very heavily disguised, but they imposed a reduction in the form of a pension levy simply because they could. So there is an element of sharing, but people would like to pretend there isn't.
Eamon, what do you say to all of that?
I suppose listening to the debate there, I mean, from the people we meet every day who are really struggling at the moment, even on the state pension, to make ends meet, we would say to people, and we've said it to late Minister Seamus Brennan as well when he would raise this issue with us, that if you want to find a reason why someone should take out a private pension or occupational pension, or should plan for how they're going to finance their retirement, they should talk to a pensioner at the moment who's surviving on the state pension. And unfortunately they don't have any options, and they are at the whim of whatever the government of the day is going to do. And that is a difficulty, and I suppose, this is where we do need to plan these things into the future. We think certainly you need to keep the state pension at a level which keeps people out of poverty, and then you need to do something proactive to make sure that people get out there and get a private or an occupational pension or some other form of income to supplement the state pension.
Samantha, you mentioned earlier on, and Eamon alluded to it too, about mandatory pensions, and this was proposed in the most recent report by the OECD. Is that your preferred option?
Certainly, given where we're at the moment, which is only 41% of the workforce has a private pension, and if you look at it by cohort, only 1 in 10 part-time workers has a pension, and only 3 in 10 women. you need to increase coverage. You cannot bring in my opinion, you cannot bring in a means testing to the state pension unless you have some sort of mandatory or soft compulsory second pillar or occupational pension schemes. And we'd be firmly of the view that mandatory makes more sense given the size of our market. Now, the problem with mandatory pensions is that you see an increase in costs from both an employer and a reduction in wages from an employee's perspective. The way you can bring it in, though, is to say, well, look, this is what is going to happen, and we fund the contributions from what could have been wage increases. And that's ultimately what happened in Australia. They mandated a low level of starting contributions of 3%. It's now going up to 12%, and that's over 20 years, so it hasn't increased to 12% overnight. I think it has to be done gradually. Mandation means it's cheaper to run, and also you force people to save, and ultimately pensions are so boring. You're not going to get people to save unless you force them, because by the time they become interested in them in their 40s, it's too late. You need to start saving earlier.
Paul, do you agree that mandatory pensions is the way to go?
I think it probably is. We did miss the boat a bit during the Celtic Tiger, because we could have done all this. We could have traded off pay increases against pension contributions quite easily when they could have been afforded, and we missed that particular boat, but it's still possible. This year they have introduced what you might call soft mandatory, that's to say auto-enrolment in the UK. Now, the indications are so far that the dropout rates, the opt-out rates, are relatively low. They're not that high, but it's very early in the day to say exactly what they're likely to be. What you're depending on there is inertia, that people, once they're enrolled in these pension schemes, will not care enough to opt out. But there will be a fairly large cohort of people in the present situation in this country who simply will have to say, I cannot afford whatever the small contribution is, and they would opt out. So the question is, how do you set the limit? Do you exclude completely from the mandatory contribution a cohort of people whose earnings are so low that the state pension at its present level would be what you might call replacement level income, and exempt those from the mandatory contribution? There's lots of work to be done on it, and what you don't want is an administrative nightmare that's going to cost employers huge amounts of money to just operate the system.
Samantha, you mentioned PRSI earlier on about doubling the rate, which you said is not achievable. What about a different sort of change to PRSI, a bigger rate, a higher rate for those higher earners?
Well, I think ultimately the higher earners end up paying more anyway, because their base salary is higher, and there's no cap now on the amount of PRSI that you now get hit for. Ultimately, I think we have to recognise that we have a deficit on the state pension and address that accordingly, either by reducing the further outgoings into the future, or by making sure that our occupational pension system is fit for purpose, i.e. that it covers everybody in the workplace. Now, ultimately, what I think needs to happen is there needs to be a low level of contributions to start off and increase it with wage inflation. Now, that sounds like a pipe dream given where we're at in our current economic circumstances. But ultimately, again, going back to the Australia example, they brought in their mandatory system right in the depths of a recession. And as the work environment turned better, they were able to increase contributions. And that's ultimately what we're looking to do here. I think one of the issues here, though, is that there is a huge number of issues with regard to pensions, be it on the state side, on the public pensions, or on private sector pensions. There's a lot of uncertainty, there's huge inequalities, and there's big issues about, as we've talked about, the financial sustainability. And I think the big issue here is that we need to effectively have pensions front and centre within the government and within a programme for government that spans governments, because ultimately government with a 5-year time horizon is never going to be able to tackle some of the issues we're talking about here.
Eamon Timmins, should the pension age be increased?
Well, it is ordering. It starts on the 1st of January coming. The transition pension is going to be abolished from the 1st of January. So people who thought they were going to get a transition pension at 65 if they retired with the gold watch won't get one if they retire after the 1st of January. So it'll be 66 before they get a pension. That's going to move out to 67 in 2021 and 68 in 2028. And God knows where it'll go beyond that. Now, there is a challenge if the government wants people to work longer as to how it's going to incentivize them to do that. Starting what's going to happen in January when people don't get a state pension? Will it incentivise or support people to go seeking work after the 1st of January? I think people out there also who are in jobs where they may not be able to work to 68 also need, if I'm working as a labourer or as a builder or something, I need to start thinking, well, what am I going to do from about 50, 55 when I'm no longer able to do some of that heavy lifting work? I need to start thinking of a second career. I think if the government is serious about this, it needs to start supporting older workers and helping people retrain, helping people be retained in the workforce. And employers need to look at it as well. And we posted a video recently on our Facebook page from BMW in Germany and how they've changed their production line to accommodate older workers, to keep them working, and to keep them working with very high productivity levels. So I think there's a challenge across society if we want people to keep working for longer.
Paul, just finally to you, raising the pension age even further.
Yeah, it does raise a lot of issues, particularly issues of people's contracts of employment and that sort of thing. Do you sit down with your employer and say, well, I was going at 65 and now I'm going at 66, and what are you going to do about it, and how can you accommodate me? There's a lot of issues to be teased out in that particular area. I think people are living longer, they're having a better quality of life. A lot of people are better able to work. But one of the things we did discuss in all the interminable discussions we had about pensions back since 1977 or whenever the first Green Paper came out, we have been having these discussions, and one of the proposals that I thought was quite reasonable was that there might be a sliding scale of state pensions depending on what age you start, so that people would have a certain option, and if they wanted to go at 65 they could get a reduced pension, and then if they stayed on to 67, 68, 69 or whatever it was, they would get an increased pension. And that's workable, it's doable, and there's no reason why it shouldn't be done.
Okay, thank you all very much indeed for taking part in our discussion this evening. Pensions Ombudsman Paul Kenny, Samantha McConnell, Chief Investment Officer with IFG Corporate Pensions, and Eamon Timmins from Age Action Ireland. We'll be back after this break.